In June of 2022, Sri Lanka was in economic turmoil. Inflation had reached an unfathomable 54.6%, and 9 in every 10 families were routinely forced to skip meals. Such was the food scarcity and economic hardship faced in the country. And so the desperation eventually reached a boiling point. On the 9th of July that year, thousands of protesters broke into President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's residence, an act that would cause him to flee the country and eventually resign. So what was it that caused this economic collapse? Ultimately, it can be put largely down to one fateful decision. Sure, the 2019 Easter church bombings and the coronavirus pandemic had a large effect on Sri Lanka's highly important tourism industry. But the true nail in the coffin was the decision by the president to make all Sri Lanka's farming organic.
The government of Sri Lanka banned the import of artificial fertilizers, pesticides and weedicides.
And it was a decision that was announced quite literally overnight. From one day to the next, farmers in Sri Lanka were banned from the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, despite many scientists warning against the potential consequences of doing so. And the impacts were nothing short of devastating. The price of rice more than doubled, as the once self-supplied crop had to be supplemented with international imports. Simultaneously, Sri Lanka's tea exports, which are crucial to the country's economy, fell by 18%. The new laws imposed effectively overturned the Green Revolution that once lifted Sri Lankans out of poverty. Looking back now, it's clear it was a decision made with good intent, but a clear lack of thought, and a catastrophic oversight of what it would mean for the population and the economy. The key question here, though, is what was really to blame? Did it prove that organic farming is simply not feasible for industrial scale food production, or was it rather the method of implementation that caused the greatest harm? As phrases like regenerative agriculture and wild farming are becoming more mainstream with increasing consciousness around environmental issues, we must ask ourselves, is this new, or actually old, way of farming really scalable? Sikkim is a place you've probably never heard of. Nestled in the eastern Himalayas between Nepal, Tibet and Bhutan, it's one of the smallest states in India, both in size and in population. It's home to the world's third highest mountain, Kanchenjunga, and approximately 2/3 of the state's area is covered by snow-capped peaks. But when it comes to organic farming, Sikkim is perhaps the world's best case study of a successful implementation. In 2015, it became the world's first fully organic state, banning all chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and non-organic seed varieties. It was, to an outsider, a radical decision. Undoubtedly, it would cause crop yields to fail, threatening the livelihoods of Sikkim's population. But there was some logic to the scheme. For starters, as one may expect for a remote mountainous area, Sikkim's agricultural productivity was never actually that good. Only 15% of its land is irrigated, and because of its topography, most land is terraced farmed, making it poorly suited to large-scale commercial agriculture. But in 1970, as the Green Revolution started in India, Sikkim did, briefly, tag on. The local government even gave subsidies for chemical fertilizers and hybrid high-yield variety seeds. Despite these efforts though, the revolution part never really happened, and the uptake of inorganic farming methods in Sikkim remained low. And here is where the government spotted an opportunity. Since productivity was low anyway and chemical inputs were limited, a shift to organic practices would likely have minimal impact. While Sikkim's situation was more low risk relative to areas dependent on commercial agriculture, the policy change remained incredibly well thought out. Unlike Sri Lanka, Sikkim's government did not impose the change overnight. Between 2003 and 2015, no legal instruments were used, and only in 2015 was a hard ban finally imposed. The consequence, a fine and a prison sentence. Throughout this time, subsidies on fertilizers were gradually reduced, and this economic incentive alone was enough to change farmers' behaviours. The impact on farmers inevitably varied, depending on how invested the farmers had become in chemical farming. In particular, it was the farmers in the south who had become more dependent on these chemical fertilizers. Because synthetic pesticides and fertilizers disrupt microbial communities and degrade soil structure, a switch to organic farming demands a period of healing. It involves practices like cover cropping, composting, and crop rotation, and it can take multiple years to restore the soil's health to how it was before. Without support, such a process would be devastating to a farmer's income. But the government weren't blind to this. They offered a cow, to many families, supplying a small income from milk, whilst also providing the organic manure now required as fertiliser. And in the years before 2015, the government offered one government job per family affected, which was instrumental in ensuring incomes were maintained whilst farm productivity dipped. And support didn't stop at financial aid. A huge emphasis was placed on education. Organic and regenerative farming require strong knowledge of natural processes to create sustainable ecosystems that support long-term agricultural productivity, and the government made training sessions available to help farmers transition to this different way of farming. So you're probably wondering what effect this policy change had on crop productivity and patterns. It definitely wasn't without challenge. Farmers reported struggling with pests and limited supply of organic fertiliser, as well as the more stringent processes of certification that came with organic produce. And although this does not seem to be entirely consistent with what the farmers themselves have reported, there doesn't appear to have been many significant negative impacts of this change. Given the organic status of their crops, farmers could now also sell their crops for more, making up for any losses in productivity. But in the case of Sikkim, the effects have been about more than just sustainability. According to an article by futurepolicy.org, the livelihood schools set up as part of the policy have led to the education of 836 unemployed people, of which over 80% are now employed as field supervisors. The scheme also boosted the local tourism sector. Between 2014 and 2017, tourism in Sikkim doubled, and the image that it had created of itself was bringing in global attention. I guess the question we have to ask ourselves though is this repeatable? Should other countries and states be trying to implement organic farming processes into their agriculture industry? While Sikkim is undoubtedly a huge success story, there are also a number of factors that make it a unique case that's not necessarily repeatable anywhere in the world. And much of this lies in the fact that Sikkim's agriculture was already low output, with limited reliance on chemical inputs. The plants grown are hardened varieties adapted to the conditions in the region and not for maximum yield. The small scale of the farms mean that most farmers have enough manure from their one cow to fertilise all their crops, with a method of cultivation that anyway didn't require as much fertiliser. So farmers don't have to deal as much with things like crops perishing or transportation costs. And one should also pay attention to the political situation behind the policy. Not everywhere would a policy like this be able to be so easily implemented. The Chief Minister at the time, Mr. Pawan Kumar Chamling, ruled Sikkim from 1996 to 2019. He was so popular in fact that the state had no opposition party, and in 2009 he and his party won a clean sweep of the 32 seats available. It was this in part that allowed the reforms to be so easily passed, whilst the small scale of the state made it easier for adequate support to be given. Nevertheless, the story of Sikkim's farming is one that extends beyond the subject at heart. It's an example of how, with the right support, compassion and common sense, sustainable farming can be for the better of all aspects of society, not just the environment. And though it's unlikely the world will ever be able to give up its reliance on chemical inputs for agriculture, there are definitely regions who could follow Sikkim's example. I'm Luke, and this was The Upshift.